Mr. Washington.
You doing all right today?
I am. How are you?
Doing wonderful, actually. It's just another beautiful day.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could say the same. These lesson plans are driving me crazy.
Sometimes it can seem like a lot, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't seem that way for you.
Well, you stay in long enough and you keep learning new things every single year, and it just gets easier and easier, believe it or not.
Well, I definitely need some tips.
Mr. Williams, how you doing today?
Mr. Williams, right on time.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Oh, it's going pretty good for this guy, but for me, I'm struggling with lesson planning.
Well, what seems to be the issue?
Well, when I log into Edugence and go into the fifth grade science curriculum, it's just a massive amount of information. I don't know where to start.
I can see how you would feel that way, but I think it's best to think about planning like it'd be a map. We start with a global view, then we want to zoom down to like a state view, and then finally we'd want to get some turn-by-turn directions.
That sounds simple enough, but how does that correlate to the lessons in the framework?
Well, let's start with the world view. Here we see the global view. It's the big picture, but not a lot of details.
Oh, so what does this have to do with planning?
Well, when you log into Edugence, you can see that the science framework is broken up into units. Here, I've selected 5th grade, Science, Unit 1. You can also see that there is a recommended amount of days that unit should take. Here, this unit should take 29 days. The units are broken down into learning experiences. There is also a recommended number of days that each learning experience should take. Here you can see that this learning experience should take about 4 days.
So what Mr. Williams is saying is that if you take the month calendar view and you look at the unit and the total number of unit days along with the learning experiences, we can use that information and plug it into the calendar to help us with our pacing. Let's take a look at what this would look like if we filled that information in.
This looks great. However, I just found out I have a field trip on September 11th. How do I go about not getting behind on pacing?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, and that's a perfect example of why I love this view. If you look at the 11th, you notice that we'll be teaching the sun, earth, moon, and the earth's rotation. If I knew that I had a field trip coming up, that is a perfect opportunity for me to plan to either move the information to the 14th, or I would have to know as an educator that I'm going to have to consolidate a little bit so that I can make sure that I get everything in.
So I get it now. I get the benefits of looking at the frameworks globally, but I still am having a hard time understanding how to create lesson plans for next week.
Well, it's kind of like stepping through, it's a process. And the wonderful thing about the way the frameworks are structured is that they start out kind of like the bigger pictures, like the unit, and then from the unit, they go down to learning experiences, and that's just smaller chunks. And then within the learning experiences, we have the 5E lesson cycle.
The 5E lesson cycle. Mr. Williams, you've mentioned that before.
Yeah, Mr. Washington, I'm really glad that you brought that up. So if we go back to our analogy, the calendar was like the global view, and now we want to zoom into the state view, and that would be figuring out which day of the week would fit into the 5E lesson cycle. Here you can see, when you zoom in from the global view, you get a little more detail. Mr. Washington, could you tell us how you zoom in from your monthly plan and get a little more detail so that way you know what you're doing next week?
I'd love to. If you look at the calendar, you'll notice that we have taken the various components of the 5E learning cycle from the learning experiences and plugged them into the calendar.
Oh, but I thought all 5 E's were done in one day. Now, looking at your calendar, I see that the 5 E's are spread out amongst the learning experience.
Wonderful observation. You'll also notice that we were able to do multiple E's on certain days. So although it's the 5E learning cycle, this learning experience actually only took us 4 days.
Mr. Williams, this is all starting to come together for me now. So what I hear you saying is the unit in the curriculum frameworks, the unit is like the global view, the world map. But the learning experience is like the state view. Now, my question is, what am I doing on Monday?
Well, that's a good point. Now that we know the global view and the state view, we know where we're headed, but we don't have specifics of how we're going to get there. So in our map analogy, this is where we would need to get some turn-by-turn directions. Here you can see turn-by-turn directions from the administration building to Pascal High School. As you can tell, they're detailed and well laid out. And Mr. Washington, I really like the way that you incorporate that methodology into your planning.
Well, some of the things that I found that work for me is really just taking the daily objective, what I really expect the children to learn, and asking myself the question, like, what do I expect the children to learn today? So I look at my SE, because it's got all the flux, but then I'm like, what do I expect them to learn today? And even more so than that, how am I going to know that they learned it? And that's kind of my foundation for beginning the planning process when we're talking day to day. So much like the turn-by-turn directions that Mr. Williams mentioned, we plan our daily lessons and include things such as pacing, timing, materials, formative assessments, differentiation, misconceptions, questioning, and the evidence of student mastery.
For my learning experience, and when it tells me what the TEAK is that my students should master, we don't have to try to master that in one day. I can break that down into daily objectives.
Absolutely.
And from there, I take my daily objectives and then I can insert a formative assessment to assess if my students met the daily goal.
Absolutely. Sounds perfect.
Making sense. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your support. This really helps me a lot.
No problem, Shonda. Glad to help. And don't forget, if you ever need any assistance like this again, don't be afraid to reach out to your Learning Network specialist. We're always an email away.